Hello, everyone, and welcome to Indigenous Voice. First of all, I would like to say Happy New Year, and not only Happy New Year, as I mentioned before, happy and a just new year. Without justice, of course, happiness does not mean anything. With this beginning with this year, we have with us for the first show Elder Tom Sampson, Elder Taslak from the Tsartlip First Nation. And Elder Tom, well, you were just telling me a story about a train, and it has a lot of wisdom in it. And if you don't mind, would you please tell us again this story for our audience to start the show?
Well, during one of my earlier years as traveling with my family, we stopped in Seattle to visit my aunt who was working at the Boeing airfield, and so we stayed there with her. So we went shopping one day, and I went into this bookstore, and I saw this old book, real thick book. The pages were thick, so I started reading it, and it was written by some guy. He was an anthropologist in England, Europe, and as I was looking at the book, I run across this story about the Barnum Bailey carnival circus that traveled all over the world, including Canada and North America. And this story was in Europe, where they were moving, I think, from France to Germany or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the train crashed, and on the train, the circus that was there, they had all kind of animals on there. Tigers, bears, everything was on this train, and it crashed. And all the cages fell open. Animals were running all over the place. And one of the stories that really caught my attention was when the Bengal tiger, considered the most fiercest of the tigers, the animals, escaped. His cage opened, and he jumped out like all the other animals. And he was running around, and he saw the chaos that was going on. The animals, everything, bears and elephants, everything were running in every direction. And when the Bengal tiger saw this, he turned around and he ran back in his cage, and he stayed there. And it was interesting for me to see that, to hear that story or read it. And when I read it, I kept on reading it to see what happened. And the story behind that is what the anthropologist was saying, is that people get trained in every society throughout the world. And once they're trained, they can stay in a cage because that's what they understand. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happened to us in Canada. The First Nations, Indigenous people. We've been in a cage for 500 years. And all of a sudden, the Supreme Court of Canada crashes, and it says, you're free now. Mm-hmm. You have the right to be an Indigenous person, and your laws and your way of life, your social way of life it's still yours. It was never extinguished. And when I think about that story, it reminds me of some of our people. When we're set free, we can practice our governments, practice our language, our laws. We don't know how to do it. We're afraid to do it, so we go back under the Indian Act, which is our cage, and we stay there because we don't know how to be free. And because of that fear, there are too many other things attached to that freedom that we were seeking. The whole history of residential schools, the whole history of the Indigenous women and girls being murdered, and living in poverty on an Indian reservation. That reminds me, that story. So as our leadership begins to try to develop itself, to move back into what we've been talking about, we always keep saying we are sovereign, we are this, but we're very much like that tiger. We talk about our sovereignty, but we stay in a cage. We don't know what to do when we get out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only Indigenous people, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are a lot of people in this country called Canada, Victoria, that are sleeping in the street. You know, they got no place to stay. And they don't know how to ask for help because they're afraid. So they find a place to cover up and sleep until somebody feels sorry, especially in this winter. You know, all across Canada, you know, the cold temperatures dropped way below zero. So you had people running for shelter, trying to find something. And some people said, okay, we'll open our doors and you can come and stay in here. And as soon as the weather gets better, get out. Go find another place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And take your tent with you, by the way. So that's happened to people.
Take your tent with you, by the way, then. Exactly.
So that's kind of what happens to people, the poor people, the ones that believe that one day somebody's going to help me and get me out of this rut we're in. But that story of the tiger, as it relates to Indigenous people, there's so many people across this country that are like that yet. You know, they're afraid to move out. They're afraid to, if they lose a reservation, that all of a sudden the world's going to come to an end. It's not going to come to an end because we haven't dealt with the true ownership of the land yet. As long as I've been in First Nations politics under the Indian Act, I met hundreds and hundreds of First Nations people in North America, all the way from New York, California, Texas, some of the states I've been to, traveling, talking to people. They always say the same thing. You know, our land was stolen from us. They took our land away, and they got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a book written about the stolen continent. It's a book written by another person. And he does a pretty good description of how this continent was stolen from the Indigenous people and how that's controlled now by governments, whether they're federal, provincial, municipal governments. They now are in control of our land.
Mm-hmm.
So when people tell us we want you to be like us, how can we forget who we are? It's impossible, you know. I know a lot of people that I've met who said to me at maybe 20 years ago, said, Tom Sampson, try to understand the reality we're living in. We have to live in the real world now.
They mean,
pardon?
Mhm. Sorry, they mean the world of robbery, the world of theft, what kind of world? If this is reality, I don't know.
Well, that's what I told him. I said, reality. Okay, let's talk about reality. What about these people that are eating out a garbage dump in northern part of Canada? What about those children who are not even teenagers committing suicide? What about the women that are being murdered? Even today, even as we talk, it's happening. So that's reality, and that's what I said to him. I said, I understand reality. The reality I know that comes from me by my great-grandfather's father gave me a name, and that's who I am. And I will never forget that. I know who I am. And so I told him, I said, look, this is who I am. I am Tsartlip. I am this person that was here for tens of thousands of years, and I'm still here. He's still here. He hasn't gone away. So when we talk in those terms, people say, get real. Live it. Let's bring yourself into the real world. And that's when I remind them about the real world that we live in.
The cage.
Yeah, the cage, yeah, they can't get out of it. And every time the door opens, we run out, and then we see what happens out there, we run back in again. And we want the Indian Act to keep control over us. So what we do then, to keep that cage in place, we have band elections, and we elect a new chief and council, and they continue the process that Sir Jane R. MacDonald created, you know. So it's hard, like I've said over a number of times, the reality that we have to live in and the reality of tomorrow is there has to be some real change. It's not going to change so long as you got people in Ottawa that talk the way they do. Even today, you know, the woman from the Senate, she got booted out of the Conservative Party because of her statement about, you know, Indians should give up their status and become like all Canadians. Well, I never asked to be a Canadian. I never asked to have, I didn't ask for this status. It was imposed on me. And they created legislation that made sure that I got stuck with that. Tom Sampson. So this woman that arguing about why can't we just forget and become a Canadian citizen. I've always been a citizen of this country. I never gave it up. That's why I have a name, Tsartlip. That's my citizenship. That's who I am. And people can't take that away from me. Even another tribe can't do it. If they want to use my name or say my name, they have to ask me. And then if I say yes, then it'll be okay. But that usually goes from family to family. It doesn't go outside of the family. So this whole idea, you know, of the cage, you know, which is the Indian Act, the Apartheid Act, I think dealing with that subject, you know, it's not because I'm raising it today. It was on the news last night. It was on the news the other day. It's on every day now. Ever since the Supreme Court of Canada said, yes, Indigenous rights is a constitutional Indigenous right, and it can't be taken away. And the judges who made those decisions said that it's always been your right, and it has never, ever been extinguished. So we deal with that subject with the new colonizers. See, one thing I learned about that tiger, Bengal tiger, is the colonized became the colonizer. We are now the keepers of the cage. We have become the keepers of the cage now. So as we look at that hard reality we live in, it affects a lot of our leadership across the country, across Canada, British Columbia, right here, local. They said, yeah, but I'm not like that. I never said you were like that. I'm talking about the Indian Act. I'm talking about every time we have a band election, the whole community gets involved, and we elect a chief and a council. So that gives the federal government the tools they need to keep us in the cage. That's how it works. So I believe that until such time as our people really understand what it is to be free, freedom, you know, what it means to be that way. We're struggling with our own leadership now. People across Canada are suing their own families now. You know, a guy on TV a couple of weeks ago, his nephew is a chief. He said, I've had enough of him. I'm going to take him to court because he's doing something that we can't support. This is an uncle talking about his nephew, his brother's, his sister's son. So people are now rebelling against, the leadership, even if it's their own family. They're doing that now. Happened here just on the mainland last year, just up the Fraser Valley. The tribe's taken their own council to court because they accepted money from Kinder Morgan, and it was in a newspaper, the Vancouver Sun, Times Colony, so I'm not telling anything that's not new. So I think it's that kind of situation that we're in amongst ourselves. We've been trained to colonize. It's just like these animals, once you get used to being in a cage and all of a sudden the door opens, now what? Now what do I do? You see all this mass confusion going on, and the only safe place is in the cage. So you go back into the cage again. And our people, unfortunately, are afraid to move forward. And it's not that they're afraid of people, afraid of ourselves. We're not afraid of each other, but it's what's being imposed on us.
Exactly.
Our own family, our own leadership from within our family it's become real dangerous for us.
The level of repeated dehumanization for a long time. Second, you mentioned the word apartheid, and just learning from the recent history, apartheid South Africa was a completely segregated society, completely racist society. The African indigenous people managed and somehow to get rid of this so-called white minority ruling, but the system that the colonialists brought to South Africa, it's so entrenched in the society to the way that, again, they stuck with that path, and we can see that from South Africa. Their troubles still the same. This homelessness, poor, the rich stay rich, and the poor stay poor.
Yeah, well, it's like I said earlier, it's not just here in North America, it's all over the world. Yeah. And I think people are willing to die for it now, and you see it happening. People getting in front of machine guns and tanks and bombs, and they're willing to die for it now. Because there are no more choices.
They are dying anyway because...
There's no more choices. It's either freedom or die, and they've chose to die. And you see this in North America, in some places here in the United States, and happen here, even here in Canada, in the early 1800s and 1700s, where they were killing people, First Nations people, because they were on the way. We want your land, and if you don't get away from your land, we're going to take it anyhow. And if you refuse, we'll kill you. Simple as that. And that's what happened in the 17th, 18th, right up into the 19th century. So it made us afraid, I guess. Fear got built in.
As you always say, Elder Tsartlip, you always come back to use their own words. Like when you talk about MacDonald, what he said in the Canadian Parliament in the beginning, 150 years ago, or wherever, when this state started. Just go and read what they wrote. I mean, it's a lot of document letters from the Protestant the British settlers, sending back to their king, talking about how the germs they were using to wipe out the indigenous population considered as a gift from God. So it's written in their own literature and their own communications. And
yeah, well, I guess that's one of the things that we've talked about for a long time. The whole education system has denied the right of our people to determine the kind of education we need in this country. It's not always about making money. It's about looking after the land. It's about making sure that generations to come will have something for them. That's what we see. I suppose it's like a lot of millionaires. They save money so that their children will never be hungry. The only problem is they're doing it at the expense of other people. We're the ones paying for these millionaires to exist. The people at the lower level, the citizens of British Columbia, are paying for these guys, so that their families are secure. There's nothing there for our families. It's empty. And because we've been trained and educated in the way we are now, our people say that, look, if they're doing it, why can't we do it? Well, that's not good thinking. When you look at California now, you look at different parts of the world where there's total disaster. Communities being wiped out altogether, whether by fire, flooding. It's just gone crazy, and the people who believed that they were doing the right thing. They're doing the right thing for themselves, because they're the keeper of the cage. But the people who are inside that cage don't have a choice. So they are the ones who pay the price. The flooding in California, the forest fires, now flooding, storms in eastern Canada, all across the country. People are not used to that. And all of a sudden, here's what you've done. Now look what happened.
And in spite of all these signs, we have the American government spending $780 billion, I think, every year on weapon and wars.
I think there's it's like every story, every event in human life. It's like any relationship, there is no perfect relationship anywhere in the world. The laws of the people are not there anymore. So you get governments that come in, whether they come from Europe or from someplace else, they have a better idea on how to make profit from the world, from the land we live in. We know that doesn't work. We've cautioned them time and time again. We've said, if you don't stop the fleet that's out there destroying the salmon, we're going to run out. Well, we're out now. So where that goes, it's the fish farmers come along and say, hey, we'll solve your problem. We'll create fish farms, and you don't have to worry about the environment anymore. We'll pollute the ocean instead. And that's what they're doing. See, we haven't learned, it's like I said at the last gathering here in this room, the quoting, saying what the elders have always said, when you're making something, make sure it's good for, not just for you, it's good for all of us. Because if you don't do it that way, you're no better than the people who are now in our land. Because they're already knee-high in their own waste, and they won't stop. They're not going to stop. That's what the elder says. This is maybe 30, 40 years ago when they made that statement. We used to gather the elders here in southern Vancouver Island. 40, 50, they would come together and we'd spend a few days together talking about the future, what we see that would help our children growing up. We saw the consequences of alcohol. We've seen it a long time ago. They called it fire water, because it was destroying us. And but it kept on happening. And fire water, we've become used to it, and now we've got drugs, LSD, marijuana coming in,
You kind of need all that kind of stuff to be satisfied inside the cage, otherwise, are kind of, so.
But I think, there is some real meaningful sight in place. But jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, that's still what's happening. And we can't seem to convince ourselves we can't do it that way. The population explosion in Canada, British Columbia, Victoria. When I step outside of my home where I live and I look across at the mountain, I see lights there now. Lights that were never there before. So people are living there. And eventually, in time, those trees are going to dry up and they're going to explode. And that's what's happening in different places in the world. When the water's gone, it's not only us that need the water. The land
they
needs
hold
water.
the water, I guess.
And we can't seem to understand that. We have difficulty in understanding that. The small little trees, they're just dry. And you've seen that in the forest fires in the United States, California, there's little sage bushes literally destroying the forest. It's fierce what's happening, but it's a kind of, I guess every so often, I read the Bible. I'm not a very good Christian, by the way, but I read the Bible once in a while. And I was reading the one chapter there, I forget what his name was now, and he said, when humans continue to disrespect the spirit of the world, the spirit of who they are, the spirit will take care of that. It will not be the human. And that's what's happening. The spirit of Canada, the spirit of North America is disappearing. And so is everything in the land. It's disappearing with it. Because we've lost that spirit. It's not there anymore. As much as we've said over the last century, especially in the last century, you tore down our institutions, our longhouses, where our spirituality was at. You burnt all our regalia. What else can you do to us now? What can you do now? You haven't killed me, I'm still here. And I know what my regalia is made out of. I know what I'm supposed to wear to honor the spirit world and the spirit of the land. I know what it is. And I know how to do those ceremonies. But they tried to destroy that. They did everything in their power. The whole apartheid system, the destroying of a culture and trying to replace it with something better. It just didn't work, And it's not, I hope people don't misunderstand me. It's not that I'm complaining. I recognize what's happening. And there have been a lot of people in this world, British Columbia, Canada, North America, have seen what's happening. And they've told the governments and the corporate world, stop, because you've gone too far now. But the monetary system has great power, people want it. They want to be wealthy. They want to have a good retirement plan. For me, my retirement plan is I want to see happiness in my family. I want to see them enjoying the world and good, some kind of comfort. And when my time comes, the end comes, I just want to go to sleep. I want to sleep. I don't want to die in misery, And I was telling my wife that one day. I was telling her, I hope the Lord takes me away in my sleep. And when I got sick with pneumonia, and I was really sick, I was scared to sleep because I might die.
Oh,
But that's the way we are. When you get older, you can say things like that, and it doesn't hurt anymore.
And by the way, Elder Tom, you brought me happiness, by the way, just by mentioning the elephant in the room. When anybody tell me about The problem is because such and such, define it, and you just said the monetary system. That is the root of the cause. Nobody try to go to that to explain or point it out plainly as you just did before we are taking a break, by the way. But again, you brought me happiness for saying, as usual, the right things in the right time. And Elder Tom, we're going just to take a few minutes break, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Indigenous Voice. Before we start, I would like to say a special thanks to the volunteer and Shaw staff who make this show possible. And we are coming back to talk with Elder Tsartlip. We already touched on many issues, especially in the end we talk about the monetary system and how it's entrenched in our society, and it's the main reason. But right now, Elder Tsartlip, how do you see the things right now for the indigenous people in 2018, in this time?
Well, as I go through my village, because that's the only place I really know, my village and my family and the community I live in, the people that speak the same language as me. I speak two languages, both the Halkamenim, Sanchathan, and English. So I speak three languages, really. And the situation we're in was clearly explained maybe 50, 60 years ago. It was done by one of the great leaders of Coast Salish people. And he was a Halkamenim person, spoke the Halkamenim language, and he was from North Vancouver. And his name was Dan George. He did a lot of movies. He was in movies and a leader in his own community. But he was also a speaker of our people. He was able to go to different places and talk about the situation that we're in. And in his talk to an education conference in the west coast of Vancouver Island, and one of the things he was quoted in one of the books written was about Dan George, and this is what Dan George said. He said, "Let no one forget it. We are a people with special rights granted to us by promises and treaties. We do not thank you for them because we paid for them, and God help us. The price we paid was paid by exorbitant. We paid for them with our culture, our dignity, our self-respect. We've paid and we've paid and we've paid until we became beaten, race, poverty, stricken and conquered." That's what Dan George said in a talk to an education conference on western and west coast of Vancouver Island. And when you look at that talk, the way he spoke at that time, and you look at what the situation is today, when I go through to our tribal office, you know, the band office is called, and I talk to the people who go there, who are looking for help, welfare, anything, assistance of some kind to get through the, you know, especially in this cold weather we just had, you know, all the light bills and hydro bills, I would imagine, are going to be pretty awesome and fierce, you know. But when I look at the help they get, the money that's guaranteed to them through social assistance, a person, single person living on welfare, I think they're around 200 and something a month. And at the most they can get is 800, I think, for a family. And it's our own people who are administering this kind of assistance. And this is what Dan George was talking about. We've paid for it. And no one has ever paid us
Mm-hmm.
for the land they took from us. It's still an unpaid bill.
Mm-hmm.
Millions and millions and millions of acres, thousands of miles of land has never been paid for. So that's what Dan George was talking about. We've paid. Canada can't ask us to celebrate in poverty. They can't ask us to celebrate the death of our children, the colonization, the residential school, the murdering of our women. How can we say thank you? You know? And this is what Dan George was talking about.
And 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've paid and we've paid until we were beaten, conquered. See, a lot of our people have accepted that idea that we are conquered. Well, there's a younger generation coming up, at least I hope so, that will be stronger than that statement. You know, it's not that it's a bad statement, it's a picture of what we've got out of life. It's a picture of desperation. Mm-hmm. And out of desperation, we say things that are real, and a lot of people are like, why can't you just be like us? How can we be like anybody else, you know? We know what we're supposed to be. We know the food that we're supposed to be eating. We know how our leadership, what it's supposed to be. We know how to train them, educate them. We've known that. But that was taken away, you know, by the very statement Sir John A. Macdonald said, take these people, teach them how to be farmers and teach them how to be something else. Teach them how to another language so they'll forget who they are. That's what Dan George was talking about. And that's what happened. So we need to hear these things, you know, when we ask, has the situation changed that much? The answer is no, it hasn't changed.
Actually, it's getting worse.
Yeah, well, you know, like, you know, in the last few weeks, you know, I attended funerals, a young girl, you know, committed suicide, two young girls. And no one knows why they done it. They just got tired and they quit. And when they were reaching out for help, it wasn't there. You know, it just wasn't there. So every so often, you know, we have to look back, you know, at the road and the path that our ancestors set out and try to remember this is what you have to know. Don't forget who you are and what you are. And Dan George said, we've forgotten that. And we've accepted, you know, the cage, the poverty cage, we've accepted it. Welfare recipients, children, third, fourth generation.
We embrace the training, kind of.
Yeah. They're afraid to, you know, to ask for more help because the colonized colonizer knows what to say now. And it's difficult to say that, you know. But when I watch the television at nighttime, watch the national Indian news that comes on every night at 10 o'clock, and I see these people marching all over Canada, right across the country, protesting. Enough is enough. It's got to stop. And this is what Dan George was saying, you know, God, we've been beaten. What more do you want? You took our land. You tell us to create economic development on a square inch of land. How in the heck do you do that? You know, we owned this country. This was our land before.
Yeah, why the question of the land? It's rarely discussed. the Canadian government would talk all the talk they want about residential school, about missing and murder women. They give time to talk about this issue. They are very important issue, but they never come to mention the land question, which is the center of everything. Uh, doesn't that say that there is continuance push to keep the myth about the Canadian state, which is contradict the reality about what happened to Indigenous people? Like especially when, for example, when we hear Prime Minister Trudeau talking about, or the previous, or all the Prime Minister talking about nation to nation talk. Who are the nations here, Elder Tom? Can you describe us them to me? I mean, are we talking about the Indigenous nations and the colonial settler nation? I mean, who are the nations here?
Well, I guess we know who the nation is, and the Supreme Court of Canada has said that 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And again, even with this American guy, American citizen now, living on that side of the border, was hunting, I think he was hunting or fishing in Canada, and he got arrested. And they took him to court, and the court said, you can't charge him because he has an Indigenous right here. He is a Canadian American. You can't take that right away.
So
Because his lineage leads him into Canada, and he belongs here. So he has a right to hunt or fish in this country called Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the courts have come down on our side again.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you know, the frustration, I guess, of the young people, you know, it's not that I don't think they're frustrated. They're afraid to step into no man's land, because it's kind of like what Dan George said, you know, we've been beaten and we've conquered. What more do you want? You know, and a lot of young people can't accept it. Well, I can't accept it either, you know. And that's why I keep talking the way I do. I know a lot of people don't agree with me. And a lot of people said, Mr. Sampson, you're a dinosaur. You should have died a long time ago. You know, so I'm a dinosaur. And I keep raising these questions like Dan George. So how do we let go of the history that we didn't ask for? It's a history I didn't want, but it was imposed on me. And who is responsible for that history? Well, for us, it's very easy and clear to see how it started. You know, the stories that our ancestors tell prior to 1492 and right up to the present day, it's still in our community, it's still in our language. In fact, the drums at home tonight they're singing about who we were 10,000 years ago. It's still happening.
Mm-hmm.
In spite of the loss and death of our children, our women. In spite of that,
Mm-hmm.
we come together every winter and we beat our drums and we sing, reminding ourselves of our history and the people who we are.
And if you are a dinosaur, Elder Taslak, you are the dinosaur of the truth, by the way, the dinosaur of wisdom. So let them say that as much they want to. But we already talked about the reality they want us to accept, which is the reality which enslave us, all of us, as you mention. And by the way, you are so modest to say that when you talk about it's not only the Indigenous people concerns and oppression. There is everybody living here is in the same part, in the same it's a struggle kind of, and for to come that to come from an elder who represent and the Indigenous people here, say how much you are beyond nations, and you are, I mean, you kind of represent, and this is truthfully what I believe, you represent the human side of the story, which is the opposite of that reality which we keep mentioning about it, which is the cage way of life.
Yeah, well, when I became a leader in my community, I was very young when I got elected as a chief and in the leadership. And I stayed there for 25 years, and I chaired the constitutional working group for the First Nations of Canada, Status Indians, and I chaired our treaty council. And I had to learn, you know, I had to remember what my great-grandmother told me. And I worked, fished and hunted with my grandparents. I had to remember that what they were doing and how they done it. Every little detail is what I had to see. And it helped me to remember and develop those skills that those people had and move it into modern time, into this generation. And when I look at this generation, including my own family, and I'd watch my great-granddaughter, she says, "Did you know this was on your cell phone?" And she says, "Look." "Oh, what the heck? How long has it been there?" She says, "It's always been there." And this is a 6-year-old great-granddaughter. So children are learning about what they need to know. The problem that they're seeing, though, is something that is not about who I am or who we are. It's about cartoons, and it's about sometimes not very good things that show up on a cell phone, because it's pretty wide open now. You know what? You can almost watch anything you want in the world. That's the way it is now. So our children then are learning at a very early age of the modern techniques of modern science, of modern communication. They know how to do that. The thing is to channel that education, that talent, into something that will talk about what Dan George was talking about, and talking about these dinosaurs that never die, you know. We have to talk about those things to our children. But it's like I said a few minutes ago, right at this moment in my community, the drums are going, and they're singing the songs of 10,000 years ago. It's still happening at this moment. It hasn't gone away. The problem that a lot of people, especially the senator that's in Ottawa, who really took a really big swing at us about who we are, and that we should give up our Indian status cards and become Canadian citizens. I never asked to be a Canadian citizen. I didn't want to. I never know what was said to me, "Tom, do you want to be a Canadian citizen?" They never asked me. They just said, "You're born, and we're going to baptize you, and we're going to give you a number, and if you want anything else, come and ask me, and I'll give it to you. If you want a driver's license, learn how to drive our way, then we'll give you a driver's license." Everything, they gave it to me. It wasn't mine. I didn't ask for it. So that's this issue of colonization. You know, a lot of people say to me, "Do you still drive?" And I said, "Yeah." "Where?" "Oh, anywhere." I said, "Yeah, but you're 82. You should, how can you do that?" "I don't know. I'm just stubborn. I want to keep driving my truck." And I enjoy traveling. You know, I go down the States, I go down to Seattle, downtown Vancouver. I can keep up with the traffic. Doesn't bother me. But it's the people that I'm driving beside, they're dangerous. You know, a guy rear-ended my truck about a month ago, and, you know, he really bent my bumper. I was stopped at there was construction on the highway there, and so there was a bunch of cars in front of me, and I was behind them, stopped, and all of a sudden this car came from behind and crashed into the back end of my truck. And, you know, and it kind of hurt my neck a little bit, not much, but enough.
This is the American highway. I mean, this is the American way. You're stuck in the American highway. Huh?
Yeah, so, you know, I had a chance to experience a lot of things. And I think it's going to be up to the future children, tomorrow's children, But unless we do it our way, the children will continue to be victims of colonization.
Mm-hmm.
The education system does not work. What needs to be done is to indigenize that system
Mm-hmm.
so it can work for us. The issue of resources, the management of resources is in our language, and they're not using it. We're using English, French, the two founding languages of this country. They call it their country, but it's not, it's mine. You know, and my language has a name for this place, you know, and it's in my language. It's not in English, it's not in French. As much as they keep saying around the world, Canada is the greatest land of freedom. Wow. You know, go up the garbage dump and see who's up there. Go down to the food bank and see who's there. Go look at the graveyards and see who's laying there, the children. That this great country called Canada. That's what he said. We've paid and we've paid and we've paid. And when I first read that, I kind of felt bad for a while, and I kept reading it, and I knew Dan George, you know. I know
You knew him personally? You knew him personally?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And his brothers and his family, the George family from North Vancouver. I played soccer against them. I canoe pulled against them. War canoe racing. I've raced against all of them. So I kind of grew up with Dan George was already a well-respected elder when I got involved in the kind of work I do now. But all of their family, you know, have always been good people, kind. Dan George was a very kind man. He went into the movies, and a lot of people were criticizing him for that, but he exposed, I believe, that given the opportunity, we can be actors too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not good actors, but we can participate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of First Nations actors in Canada and North America that have done well in that industry because they were given a tiny little opening opportunity, you know. And when you look at the awards, the global awards the other night, you know, and watching the women protesting about the way they're being treated, you know, by men and the industry. It's not a pretty picture, you know. And the women in our communities have always been at the leadership. They were always responsible for our leadership. You know, my great-grandmother, she talked to me. I never spoke English till I was 7, and I had to go to school. And that's when I began to understand, you know, the language of English. I even I was good at French at one point. I could speak French. And I did well while I was in high school, but then I couldn't handle the Christian stuff. You know, it's not that Christianity is bad, I just couldn't fit in. I'm not a good Catholic. I was baptized as a Catholic, but I'm not a very good Catholic.
It's not organic. It's not organic to you. It's not part of your culture. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you look at the leadership in this country, in Canada, North America, the world, you look at the people who fought against the system, you know, and were murdered, you know, whether they're Indigenous people in North America, Canada,
South America.
they were killed because they wanted change. You know, Kennedy, Gandhi, all these people wanted change. They wanted to be who they are. And they were killed for that reason, because they got on the way. Well, that's what happened to us too. We got on the way. But I'm optimistic about the future because I see my children, grandchildren, great grandchildren,
Learning.
they're learning and they're asking questions that I never asked when I was a little boy. Well, it's not that I didn't know, that just wasn't there. You know, I grew up in a home where there was I never had a bed when I was a little boy. I slept on the floor, on a mattress. We had no running water in my house, my great-grandma's house. We had no electricity. Our bathroom was out in the backyard where we had to go. I grew up like that. And my great-grandmother always talked to me about, you know, you've experienced what the old people went through. Now remember, don't think you're smart and you know everything, because you haven't learned anything yet. And so I began to study and learn. When I became chairman of the tribal council, I immediately organized to help bring the elders in to tell us what we had to do in the future. Some 50 elders came together and said, here, this is what you have to do. The first thing you have to learn is to listen. Listen. And if you can't listen, you don't need us. You might as well, we're going to go home. That's what they told me. So for 5 days, they pounded it into us. And then she said, now, every winter, when the drums start, go there. Go to your house, the longhouse, and listen to the talk, because it's going on right now.
Elder Tom, talking about listening, this is exactly what we are doing here, listening to everything you said. But I'm listening also to our cameraman. He's telling me that we are out of time. But again, as usual, we hope always we will have you again to tell us more about, especially about this experience with the elders, because this is always important to hear this story you told us about before. Thank you so much for being on the show, and hopefully we'll be in 2 weeks from now again.
Well, I'll be busy in the month of February, so...
So we'll be back in February.
Yeah, well, just give me a call and I'll see if I can make it, you know.
I will do that for sure, Elder
Yeah.
Tom. And thank you very much for watching today's show, and have a very nice time.